Okay, well, I'm going to get us started. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to our Rising from the Ashes webinar. This is the first in a series of webinars from our Rangeland working group. This webinar will showcase some of our amazing alliance partners and the rewilding journey they're on, having started from degraded landscapes. My name is Isarin Tihon. I am the Partnerships and Engagement Manager at the Global Rewilding Alliance. Now, this webinar is a collaboration with Wild Foundation, whose mission is to expand and empower global coalitions that defend Earth's life-saving wilderness. And Naturnae Weidelandschaften. I've been practicing this, so my German is not my first language, so excuse my German. Translated to near to nature grazing landscapes. And this is a group of practitioners and academics from Germany committed to large scale and extensive grazing, kind of like in the form of wild pastures. And this is a central strategy to reestablish the protection of nature and landscapes in politics and society. Now, for those who are still trickling in and who are new to our space, the Global Rewilding Alliance brings together organizations all around the world working on rewilding, which can translate to restoring the functionality of ecosystems. Our mission is to catalyze rewilding into science, policy, and practice globally. And we do that together with over 300 alliance partners in more than 150 countries around the world. Pretty impressive. For today's webinar, we will start with a short introduction by our co-founder and director of campaigns, Carl Wagner. Can you please wave? There he is. We will then head straight into our three presentations where you will meet Stefan Zutter. Could give a little wave as well, thank you, who is the project manager and researcher at Frankfurt Zoological Society for the Altendala Conservation Initiative. And I believe they just released 5 new wild horses last week. So quite an exciting time. Congratulations on that. We will then get into a presentation with Tim Woodfine, little wave, there he is, who is the Chief Executive Director at Sahara Conservation. And we will end with Christian Saucedo, a little wave, there he is, who's a Wildlife Director at Rewilding Chile. Now, throughout the webinar, please drop your questions in the Q&A, and we will answer these after the presentations. Now, enough from me. I will pass it on to you, Carl.
Well, thank you. Welcome, everybody. I'll follow up with a few comments on Isalin's introduction on the Global Rewilding Alliance, on rewilding itself, and on our involvement in restoring rangeland ecosystems. Now, as Isalin has already mentioned, the role of the Global Rewilding Alliance is to support and to strengthen all initiatives that work on restoring the functionality of ecosystems, and with it, the ecosystem's ability to deliver the goods and the services that humanity actually depends on for survival, for well-being, and for prosperity. This need to restore the health of ecosystems, so you call it identity or functionality, there are different kinds of terms that all mean the same essentially, has been recognized by all major biodiversity-related international conventions. And we are working actually hard right now in order to make policy and decision makers understand that the health of ecosystems is fundamental to achieving the targets of the SDGs too. Now, how do we actually support our members and our partners? We do that in various ways. We create common ground on science, on communications, and we provide platforms and manage the platforms that enable them to do networking, skill sharing, and so on. And one of these platforms is the working group, the Global Alliance Rangelands Working Group, where sort of those members who work on rangelands, quite a few of them, I must say, meet and where they sort of develop positions and interventions. Now, when we talk about rewilding, restoring the functionality, what does that actually mean for us? Well, first of all, bringing back nature. First of all, it's context dependent. There is no one size fits all All our partners work under very different sociological, ecological, political circumstances and challenges, and you always have to find the right kind of a solution for the right kind of a problem. Second, it's clearly about bringing wild animals back, actually the animals that we have removed so efficiently. And that means sort of repairing the food chain, because the food chain is the backbone of the ecosystem, and it's also the conveyor belt for nutrients and for carbon. And on the other side, also sort of to make sure that the key elements of this food chain, namely the keystone species, those that we call the ecosystem engineers, that they are present in sufficiently large numbers so that they can fulfill the ecological role. If you do that, and we've seen many, many examples, if you introduce the keystone species back, you will see that there is a cascade of species returning, and with it the functionality, because the species fulfill their specific environmental ecological roles in the system. Third, it is about giving nature enough space to develop and to be itself, so to say, without any kind of exploitation or with a minimal kind of an exploitation pressure. And we are looking there also sort of to the traditional pastoralism and indigenous people who do have a practice and understand how this can be done. Fourth, it is about people. We're living on a planet with 8 billion people, and the desires and needs are still growing. But at the same time, we manage to dig ourselves into a deep hole of a systemic crisis, largely because of the pursuit of material exponential growth for a 200-year period. What's the consequence of that? Like we have stepped over planetary boundaries. We've degraded most of the terrestrial and pelagic ecosystems on the planet. And we've entered an era of resource scarcities that not only concerns non-renewable, it concerns renewables, forests, fish, water, and so on. So we evidently need to stop digging. We have to come to terms with each other and with today's reality. We believe it's crucial to be able to compromise, to be pragmatic, but to also prioritize the key relevant objectives and to leave the silo and special interest perspectives behind. We should look at resource management, exploitation, food production, consumption, and so on through the lens of today's world. And there are a lot of systemic solutions out there. It's not that we don't know what to do. It's that we don't do it. There are a lot of systemic solutions, and restoring the functionality of ecosystems, also known as rewilding, is a core one. Now, as Iselin has also said, this is the first of a series of webinars that will sort of portray the diverse and multi-layered scope of the work and ambitions of the members of the Global Rewilding Alliance and its partners outside. The focus of today's webinar is on restoring natural grasslands, on bringing back keystone species from the brink, and on partnerships between conservation, rewilding, governments, pastoralism, and so on. And in autumn, we will sort of start exploring in the next webinar more thorny issues of coexistence between domestic animals and wild animals, between people and predators, and so on. Yes, I hope you will sort of join our next webinars too, where the next one will be in autumn. Well, thank you for your attention to this matter, and I hand back to Iselin.
Thank you, Carl. And I will just hand it straight on to you, Stefan. And as we're moving around the people on the screen, yeah, can forward this as me and then Stefan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Iselin. Hello, everyone. I will start sharing my screen. So I'm working for the Altendala Conservation Initiative, which is a large-scale, long-term grassland conservation and restoration initiative in Kazakhstan. But my affiliation is actually Frankfurt Zoological Society. Frankfurt Zoological Society is an NGO in Germany with a long history already, with about 1,500 staff spread across 4 continents with 19 countries. And one country where we work is Kazakhstan, and that's our focus for today. But first, before talking about the project, I would like to take you on a small excursion to the history, which is kind of the baseline for our work. The history of Kazakhstan has been characterized by many drastic changes. So at the beginning of the 20th century, people in Kazakhstan were still widely nomadic, although this nomadic traditions, this nomadic land use was already declining during the Russian Empire. But during the Soviet Union, at the beginning of the 1930s, people were forced to stay at one place, to live in villages, and livestock was taken as a state asset. And this led to a great famine in Kazakhstan, leading to the death of about 1.5 million people in the country. Big catastrophe. So many died, but also many fled out of Kazakhstan at that time. And basically, nomadism has ended at that point. Another big change of the land use in Kazakhstan was the Virgin Land campaign in the 1950s, mostly at the beginning of the 1960s, which led to millions of hectares, more than 25 million hectares being plowed up to become agricultural land, mostly in the northern part of the country. And the native steppes were lost at this time. But then another big change was the breakdown of the Soviet Union around 1990, which led to a collapse of all land use and an economical crisis in the country, rather chaotic situation with lacking governance, and many people left remote areas because there was no further support for them. And this led to vast abandoned landscapes, many abandoned villages, and even whole regions became without any human beings. But at the same time, also poaching was rising, leading to a sharp decline of wildlife populations as people used them to feed on wildlife, but also to make money on it. So with this situation, we basically started. It was a situation like this here on these pictures, with rather empty landscapes without any wildlife you could find. When I started in 2007 in Kazakhstan, it looked like this, and a lot of abandoned villages, like you can see here on the pictures on the right side. So we started then with the Altendala Conservation Initiative, which is an initiative of 5 organizations. First of all, to be mentioned is the Association for the Conservation of Biodiversity of Kazakhstan, a national NGO leading the implementation, and the Committee for Forestry and Wildlife of the Ministry of Ecology in Kazakhstan. And then there are 3 international NGOs, Fauna and Flora, Frankfurt Zoological Society, and the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, which all provide technical expertise, but also funding for this initiative. So what do we actually do in the framework of this initiative? Just some main points. We started back in 2006, so when the situation was still rather dramatic. We work at an area of about 75 million hectares in Kazakhstan, which is defined by the historical range of the Saiga antelope, which is the ungulate species in Kazakhstan. And this was the area where we decided to work. We work in different ecological zones in the steppe, semi-desert, and desert in Kazakhstan. And the goal was always to restore the ecosystems of these zones and make them functional again, and to have protected, connected, and restored landscapes for nature and people, leading then finally to a peaceful coexistence of people and wildlife across large landscapes. Now, to take you briefly through some impressions of our project area, This is, for instance, the feathergrass steppe in the more northern parts of our project area. A nest of a steppe eagle in the semi-desert. A demosaic crane, a very, very beautiful bird living there in these grasslands. The steppe marmot, more in the northern parts, again, of our area. And very beautiful birds, not birds, plants, the tulips, which do not originate in the Netherlands, but actually in Central Asia, in the grasslands of Central Asia. And to give you an impression of the whole diversity of elements we work with, birds, mammals, domestic livestock, and people. So really using an ecosystem approach. Central to many of our efforts has been the Saiga antelope. That's how a male of this antelope looks like. And this antelope was the last remaining ungulate species in these grasslands and is a keystone species for these ecosystems due to several factors. First, they provide a very variable, extensive grazing, supporting a diverse vegetation in these landscapes. They disperse seeds over long distances as they are migratory between summer pastures in the north and wintering areas in the south. They trample seeds into the soil, which helps them to germinate. They are extremely crucial to maintain the nutrient cycle in these grassland ecosystems, supporting plant growth and thereby also other animals, insects, reptiles, birds, mammals. That's what Carl mentioned before. And they support carbon sequestration. So they're actually important for these ecosystems to become, or to have an important role for climate change mitigation. And they serve as an important prey species for many predators, raptors, and also as food for scavengers. So what the situation looked like at the beginning when we started, more or less here, shown on this diagram, there are 3 populations of taiga in Kazakhstan. And what happened in the 1990s after the breakdown of the Soviet Union was a dramatic decline in numbers by more than 95% of this species. So I will just use the taiga as an example to show how we work and what we've done to change the situation. So our approach was in the framework of the Altendala Conservation Initiative to work with the people. So we did a lot of environmental education across the whole project area, met with local people, talked to them, explained what the situation is like, and heard from them what they think. We improved the monitoring of wildlife and did a lot of research, which provided us data to then designate new protected areas in the project area. We helped to support rangers and support their anti-poaching work with equipment and training so that they were better capable to protect wildlife from poachers, which were quite numerous still at the beginning. At the same time as the horn of taiga is traded illegally, we supported customs and border guards to fight the illegal trade in wildlife products like the taiga horn. And last but not least, we, this is a strange picture maybe for this, but we managed to fight negative impacts of barriers, linear barriers like fences shown here, to mitigate these impacts on animals like the taiga antelope, which need open space to migrate and need passages for crossing such infrastructures. For all this, these measures, it's not a complete set of measures here, but all this was successful in the end, and our initiative has been awarded to be one of the World Restoration flagship projects of the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, which is kind of evidenced by this diagram, which is basically the same as before, just added by the last 15 years. So you can see the taiga populations have recovered well and actually exceed, at least in 2 populations, the levels which have been recorded during Soviet time. So that is a remarkable success of the conservation of a wildlife species like the Saiga antelope, probably as the decline before in the 1990s, unseen before. So you have now a landscape looking like this, with a lot of Saiga running around, and at some places there are even too many of them, which leads to conflicts with people living in these areas. So people using these lands to graze livestock and to grow crops, they complain about too many Saigas being there who graze on the pastures they need for their livestock, graze on hay fields or on arable land, or trample on arable land, and cause damage for these farmers. So we, in the end, face currently new challenges despite this species conservation success. Due to the large number of Saigas, we have a significant human-wildlife conflict in Kazakhstan. At the same time, there has been expanding agricultural use, subsidized by the government, leading to growing livestock numbers. And these subsidies really targeted only the number of livestock, but were not targeting an improved management of pastures or land use. The human dimension requires much more attention by us in our activities than in the past. I mean, we have used to work with them before, but it's even more important now as we have these conflicts. The goal should be that people should be involved in decision making and receive benefits from coexisting with wildlife in these rangelands in Kazakhstan. And another challenge is that Saiga populations develop extremely fast, which make all these adaptations which are necessary also in the land management and planning very difficult, because Saigas are faster basically. And top-down decision making is still widely used in Kazakhstan and integrated in the legislation and thinking, which makes it difficult to introduce new approaches. Beyond that, and this conflict-related stuff, there's also a lot of new linear infrastructure being developed, which is problematic for the wildlife in these rangelands, which require open spaces. And we have an ongoing equid reintroduction at one site in Kazakhstan, which is particularly suitable for this. And this is not an easy project and requires a lot of efforts and time and money. So that's another site challenge. Let's say I will not elaborate on this more, maybe in the question and answers later. So what we did to tackle these challenges, particularly concerning Saiga and the conflict, a strategy for the conservation and management of Saiga in Kazakhstan has been developed by by all stakeholders basically involved in land use and Saiga conservation, supported by the Convention on Migratory Species. So land users, scientists, government officials, scientists, hunters, they all came together to develop a strategy. A key element of this is an involvement of all stakeholders in decision making, that the land use planning should be more complete to identify priority zones for wildlife and agriculture, and consider both the needs of agriculture and wild animals. Saiga antelopes should be sustainably used as they grow rapidly, as you have seen, and this use should be based on scientific evidence in order to avoid harm for the species. Illegal and strictly controlled trade in Saiga products should be possible in the future, but benefits from sustainable use and trade should also reach local people at the Saiga range, so that they really get benefits from having Saiga in the environment. and conservation actions which have been implemented through all the years should be continued, as the species is still vulnerable to catastrophes and might still disappear. And an intensified monitoring is needed to feed all these other things with data, which is needed. We also have a landscape restoration project in Western Kazakhstan with our partners from RSPB, analyzing the situation there in Western Kazakhstan, the land use and the use by Saiga. Basically aiming to improve the land use in this area and to understand the conflict, to make this this landscape and the use in this landscape fit for the future without conflicts. Another project funded by SNAP aims to look for at scenarios for future development of this area in Western Kazakhstan, where most of the conflicts happen, involving local people, the knowledge of local people and scientists, to see what scenarios might be possible and what should be done to make these landscapes resilient to future challenges and current challenges. Very useful project, and good to have different levels of science and local knowledge being involved. And finally, we have done an investigation of the human-wildlife conflict in Western Kazakhstan with the local people, interviewing them, understanding the conflict, and the drivers which are actually underlying these conflicts, which is also water use and agricultural policies, which fuel this conflict. And this understanding makes it possible to actually tackle it in the right way. And we try to give through this work with local people to give them a voice also towards the government to improve their situation. So that's basically where we are at the moment. More to be continued, but that's all from me for now. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Stefan, for that. It was such a lovely presentation. And I just saw recently as well that the count of Saiga went up to 4.69 million. So it's quite a success story in that sense. But as you mentioned, it probably a lot of conflict arises from that. So it's nice that you're also tackling those and looking forward to that, to hearing more. And now I will pass it on to Tim. Good. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Iselin, and hello, everyone. I hope that you can now see that slide. Is that looking okay there, Iselin, for you?
Yes, perfect.
That's great. Okay, thank you. And thank you, everyone, for the opportunity to share this story with you during what is actually the 10th anniversary of oryx being returned to the wild in Chad. And just a quick thought in relation to the title of the webinar. Rising from the Ashes is a great analogy for the species. But interestingly, the Wadi Rimeh Wadi Ashim Faunal Reserve, where they've been returned, remained largely ecologically intact. So this is a good example of a timely intervention of putting back missing components to re-establish or strengthen ecosystem integrity while the opportunity still existed. So a quick overview. I'll take a minute to explain some wider context about the Saharan region before sharing some thoughts about how we built the foundations for what we think is a successful project. I'll then talk about some of the key biological and social outcomes of the initiative before ending with brief retrospective thoughts on why I think this all came together well. Sahara conservation was born out of a need to address a silent extinction crisis and degradation of natural environments that were and continue to be misunderstood, overlooked and under-resourced. And even today, there's still a common belief that the desert is a deserted wasteland, when in fact it comprises a range of unique ecosystems, is home to specially adapted species, and a real richness of human culture. And the environments range from sand dunes and stony plateaus and rocky outcrops through to central Saharan mountain massifs and forested valleys and ephemeral rivers. and the arid steppe grasslands and forest belts of the Sahel to the south and northern peripheries of the Sahara. And these volatile systems are dominated by highly adapted annual rather than perennial grasses. And this is an important point because Sahelian transhumance pastoralists move their herds north to exploit the annual grasses during the brief rainy seasons, then retreat south when they wither. And this strategic mobility directly mirrors the rapid life cycle of the vegetation. So it can turn what can be a volatile environment into a sustainable resource if done in that traditional way. And even where you least expect it, there are remarkable forms of life. And this is quite an old image now, but it's of addax antelope in the Tintuma Desert in Niger, just to illustrate that point. Although we work across the region, because of their size, ecological significance, and how relationships have developed over the years, we focus on these particular critical landscapes in Chad and Niger. But for today, let's have a look at the return of the oryx to the Wadi Rimeh, Wadi Ashim Faunal Reserve in Chad. The reserve is 78,000 kilometres squared. So for an analogy, it's about the size of Scotland, if you live in this part of the world, almost the size of the state of South Carolina in the US, and for Isaline's benefit, twice the size of Belgium. And it was established in the 1960s, but has been largely under-resourced, undermanaged, and often lacked regulation throughout its history. For those who may not be familiar with the species, the civet-horned oryx is a medium-sized antelope that was once extremely abundant and widespread across the arid steppes of the Sahel and other parts of the Sahara. And we believe from genetic studies that the modern animals are descended from a population of over 1 million oryx, not in the very recent history, I hasten to add, but more probably in the last few thousand years. Nevertheless, congregations of thousands of oryx were still reported well into the 20th century. So we can imagine the ecological significance of these large migratory herbivores that co-evolved with those vegetation communities. Since then, the species suffered catastrophic decline due to illegal overhunting, habitat degradation, barriers to their movement, some exacerbated by periods of prolonged drought and civil war in the 1970s and 80s. And I think this may be the last photograph of oryx in the wild taken in the 1980s in the Aïr Mountains in Niger by our founding CEO, John Newby. And by the 1990s, there were no more free-living oryx left. And by 2000, they were officially declared extinct in the wild under the IUCN Red List. So the good news is that today there are at least several hundred oryx living in Wadi Rimeh, Wadi Ashim Faunal Reserve in Chad. And the species was downlisted from extinct in the wild to endangered at the end of 2024. And a mark of success, I guess, is that the population estimates are now needed, as there are just far too many of them, dispersed over too large an area to track all individuals anymore. But how do we go from extinction in the wild to once again seeing herds of oryx back in their natural environment? And to answer that, I'm going to try and sum up what has been 2 decades of very complex work in 3 words. Firstly, building legitimacy with governments, local leaders, international technical partners and donors was a critical foundational step. And it took a decade with Sahara Conservation, I think quite uniquely placed to act as a facilitator, convener, to consult and build understanding and consensus. And we can break this down into, I think, 3 areas. Firstly, the international technical partners and global holders of captive oryx, because without animals, of course, there's no project. Secondly, local voices, and it was fortunate that oryx still featured in the living memory of community elders, and there was motivation to restore that cultural heritage. And thirdly, and critically, a shared vision and partnership that was built in the process between the government of Chad, motivated by cultural, social and economic reasoning, and the government of Abu Dhabi, represented by their Environment Agency, and motivated by their own interests in species conservation, arid land restoration, and a desire and the resources to make a difference. So those discussions went hand in hand with identifying suitable landscape. Was there space available? Were the causes for decline and loss understood, and could they be addressed? And Wadi Rime, Wadi Hashim had sufficient space, and surveys showed that a largely intact ecosystem and suitable habitats still existed. Crucially, the continuity of transhuman pastoralism may have been one of the reasons the landscape retained its ecological integrity and avoided the fragmentation that we've seen elsewhere. And indeed, in many parts of the world, rewilding is about repairing an ecosystem. In Wadi Rime, Wadi Hashim, it's about recognizing that it still worked and putting back components to reestablish missing ecological processes and strengthen the system further. And the last part of this is about logistics and the planning and the preparation. And there's 4 representative images here to simplify, as I say, what is quite complex issues. The top left there, the project relied on assembling what we called a world herd of oryx in Abu Dhabi, based on genetic studies of the global captive population, those in zoos and private ownership, and physically bringing breeding stock together to optimize genetic diversity. And that became the founder population for reintroduction. Below that, just an image of what is Oryx Base Camp, which is a remote solar and wind-powered outpost strategically positioned in the reserve. And obviously having those facilities to receive animals and for people to be based at to carry out their work was obviously technically quite a demanding process. To the right of that, the aircraft is really there just to represent the importance of preparing and undertaking the safe international transport of animals. It's a huge undertaking in itself, not only the international flight, but a several-hour operation off-road from the nearest airport to the reserve. And it's an operation that has been taking place annually for a decade. And finally, top right, nothing happens without skilled people. So training and equipping local team was and continues to be a big priority for the project. So after a decade of careful planning and preparation, the first transport of oryx arrived in Chad in 2016, and more have followed each year to build and reinforce the founder population. And for anyone involved in conservation translocations, this moment's a headline grabber, and it's certainly an important milestone, but despite all the complex preceding work, this is really where the challenges begin. So let's have a quick look at some of the headline outcomes in terms of the wildlife population's social impact and how the initiative has enabled wider work. Today, several hundred oryx now live in Chad. The confidence limits of population estimates range, so there could be in excess of 1,000, but we prefer to work at the conservative end of that range. It's not been without setbacks. We had some disease outbreaks in 2018, and in 2024, there was high mortality of both domestic and wild herbivores because of prolonged period of very, very hot weather. But actually, since then, conditions have improved and the oryx numbers rebounded pretty quickly. The Oryx project acted as an umbrella and an enabler for bringing back other significant components of the ecosystem. So after their local extinction, we now have about 150 addax in the reserve. And more recently, animals have found their way from Wadi Rime, Wadi Hashim, all the way over to the Enedi Natural Reserve in the north, which is managed by our colleagues at African Parks. And that's an important step in demonstrating wildlife connectivity. We've also returned the red-necked, or the northern African subspecies of ostrich, and are carrying out work to safeguard and reverse the decline of the critically endangered Kadama gazelle. And we've been able to initiate the first studies and community engagement programs concerning vultures in this part of Africa as vital components of ecosystem and human health. And there are many other examples of species and aspects of biodiversity receiving attention for the first time, including migratory birds attracted to seasonal water, and other species that with more localized movements. And we know an awful lot more now about other parts of the food web, local carnivores. But the project has brought employment and skills transfer opportunities needed for the long-term adaptive management of the reserve. And I think last year we employed over 100 people on our programs and activities in Chad. So it gives you an idea of the sort of scale of the operation. We've also been able to bring resources for reserve management, and one of the most significant interventions is fire management programs, essential for protecting people, pasture, livestock, and wildlife. And this includes responding to fires, but also cutting fire breaks as a control measure. And because of our established presence, we can get to places that other agencies can't always reach on their own. So we facilitate healthcare missions for people who otherwise have little or no access to these services. So by 2022, the ecological, cultural and socioeconomic significance of these rewilding initiatives were recognised regionally through the Central African Bank. And alongside the elephants of Sakuma that you can see on that banknote on the right, you can see oryx, addax and ostriches of Wadi Rime, Wadi Ashim Faunal Reserve on the 5,000 Central African franc note, which I think is something of a reflection of regional as well as national pride in the outcomes. So building on that progress, there was a desire from all parties to address the question of how biodiversity and ecosystem services can be sustained in a very big, previously largely unregulated environment in the long term, in recognizing that wildlife can only thrive where people's needs are also met. So as a result, we work with the government and communities to create a management plan for the reserve. And where this differs from many traditional protected area management plans is that it explicitly recognizes that people are part of the ecosystem and not external to it, and seeks to blend biodiversity objectives with local livelihoods and knowledge systems. So in other words, the plan treats well-adapted pastoral systems as part of what makes the landscape special and is about sustaining biodiversity in a working pastoral landscape. And to put it another way, there isn't a question about choices between people and nature. It's a balanced question about how, in a changing world, people, livestock and wildlife can thrive together for mutual benefit. And for me, the emerging phases of our work under this plan are the most important. So considering biodiversity, ecosystem function and services, mobility and access to life-sustaining natural resources in a holistic way. So as you can imagine, the plan centres around issues such as sustaining pasture and access to water, particularly seasonal sources that are critical for mobile pastoralism and for mobile species. And as you can see here, these water pans are shared by livestock, probably see in the top right there, as well as wildlife. So I hope you can see this isn't a story about rebuilding a ruined ecosystem. It's a story about recognizing the value of a functioning rangeland, restoring species that had been lost, and working with pastoral communities to ensure that ecological processes could be strengthened and continue into the future. And I'll just end on some brief thoughts about why I think the initiative has worked well to date. And you may not be surprised to hear that these are all very human reasons. Firstly, partnerships have been central. Developing and maintaining trusted relationships and alignment around the vision has been the single most important factor, in my view, and particularly important in complex environments with dispersed stakeholders. And for us, progress comes with patience, understanding, a willingness to listen, to accommodate, to adapt, and we're grateful for those values to be reciprocated in those partnerships. Secondly, in a world that seems increasingly in the moment and demands instant gratification and endpoints, having funding, community and governmental partners that understand that long-term commitment is essential and that we're on a journey of progressive improvement and not a final destination is really important. When we think about it, oryx may have received attention because of rarity and of cultural importance, and we've kind of addressed those issues now. Although not to rest on our laurels, because these gains can, of course, be reversed. But the oryx was once the dominant large herbivore shaping these ecosystems. So to see that level of functionality return will take much longer because their impacts are currently diluted in a very big place. So this is ultimately not about single species, but about ecological roles. And thirdly, all landscapes, ecosystems and socioeconomic systems are complex. So having a plan is helpful, but it's difficult to predict precise outcomes from any intervention. So it's essential to continually evaluate, adapt, and keep a practical, open mind. And perhaps most importantly, we weren't starting with a blank sheet of paper. The reserve still functioned as a pastoral landscape. Rewilding, in this case, pragmatically works with and welcomes that reality. And I think all of those factors are collectively critical in a rapidly changing world in which the fabric and functioning of society is shifting along with global climate. So I'm going to end there just with some quick acknowledgements of our key partners. And if anybody's interested in learning more, our annual report is now published. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Tim. That was really, really inspiring. Thanks for making that little note about Belgium. It always gives me a perspective. And I also I love the fact that these animals are coming on these banknotes. I think that that's really a beautiful way to value these species and these ecosystems. So thank you so much. I will pass it on to Christian now.
Great. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to introduce a little bit on what Rewilding Chile does in the southern South America. The focus of the organization is related with the connectivity and the restoration of large-scale ecosystem. We are the legacy of Tompkins Conservation, of two North American entrepreneurs that came down to Chile, that fall in love with Patagonia and start a pioneer work of conservation and restoration at the early 90s. At that time they were, of course, subject of question, not well understood by politicians, by communities. So it was a tough time when they promote and start this work. Right now, as Rewilding Chile, we keep working, we keep doing that work in what we name the root of parts of Chile and Patagonia. And the three main pillars of our work are related with the park creation, basically related with the creation of national park, the restoration of wildlife interactions or the ecological network, and of course the involvement and of the community through outreach of the local communities. Along these 30 years in Chile and Argentina, through Tompkins and Rewilding Chile and Argentina, we have been able to secure a large number of national parks in the Southern Cone, 7 new national parks in Chile, 3 expansions, and in Argentina as well, national parks and marine national parks as well. So the seeds that Doug and Chris start at the early 90s are over time expanding over the Southern Cone and even so along the South American or through the continent. So I would like to focus the conversation and a little bit of story of a particular initiative that were developed on the early 2004. That was the creation of the Patagonia National Park in Chile. This project started in 2004 with the creation of, with the purchase of a former livestock ranch. I had the challenge and the opportunity to be part of this team, to be part of the process. So the project here was to buy over 80,000 hectares of land and make a master plan to gradual remove livestock and create a national park with a surrounding community that was the main cultural activity was the relationship with sheep, small farms and peasants, and this large ranch. For that, the invitation was to be part of this team, but it means that I should move down in this remote location with the family. In this case, I'm here with my wife and the two kids, and we live there and we start, let's say, a modern era of this transition of the sheep ranching for become with the dream to create a national park. That was the challenge. Where this was located in a district that is named Aysén and is nearby the border with Argentina. Was a kind of a dream. When I just arrived there was, well, we hope that in the next 8 years or 10, who knows, we will be able to create this national park. The model was basically that the land was transferred in some time for the Chilean state to become an official designated and managed by the Chilean Park Service. So that was the vision, that was the dream. For some people was great, and for others, of course, they disagree totally with this idea because traditionally or historically, national parks in Chile were seen in a way that lost landscape or lost land for traditional or productivity land. So the use of this land was mostly dedicated for sheep. There were over 30,000 sheep in this land, 3,000 cattle, and of course, with all the consequences that we most of all know about the exceeding the carrying capacity of the land. So degradation of the land, overgrazing, erosion, and of course, a number of conflicts with wildlife. Of course, this ranch provide local jobs, but those jobs, they were not so many, and they were not so well paid, and not good quality jobs as well. And of course, as happened in most grassland system, there were no good relationship of the traditional ways of production or the grazing of sheep and cows with predators, with native herbivores like guanacos, the South American camel, or even the South Andean huemul or deer that is an endangered species as well. So this was the traditional way of relationship. This is the shape of the land. The dark green represent the former sheep ranch, the big ranch, and the two light green were already national reserves managed by the Chilean Park Service. So basically was pretty simple, was give the dark green land to the Chilean state and designate the 3 pieces as a national park, because national reserves in Chilean legislation were in lower status in terms of conservation. Basically, I mentioned there were a number of ecosystems. There were extensive grasslands, Patagonian steppes, southern beech forests, lakes and ponds, and of course some glaciers and mountain environment. This is the Chacabuco River, who gives the name for the main valley bottom of this park. And important to say is that as this ranch was a productive area for livestock, the neighboring national reserves, they were protecting, let's say, just highland portions of land. So this portion provide lowlands, wintering areas for wildlife, and of course provide connectivity between these two pieces already protected. Traditionally, also regarding grasslands, in many cases, people who visit say, "Oh, this looks like a desert. There were no many life here, but we all know that grassland systems are pretty rich and inhabited by a number of unique species well adapted to this environment." So the challenge here was to move forward to develop a master plan to reduce the livestock, to promote good practice with predators, but the challenge was how this will affect the native herbivores like guanacos and endangered huemul. So one of the first actions that we developed were related to the fact of remove fences. There were over 800 kilometers of fences that were removed. Some of those fences were super easy because nearby to roads, but some were super hard to access. So we receive a lot of manpower from volunteers who came every spring and summer. We receive over 100 volunteers per season for over 10 years. So it represents a super landmark because people were really involved in the creation of this future park. At that time, we were dreaming with the fact that at some day the park was created. Guanacos were inhabiting there. Of course, Guanacos was identified as a competitor for grassland with sheep, and they were not so welcome by the former owners of the land. And gradually they start, of course, to recover space and numbers along the territory. The local people who were working for the ranch was also invited to be part of this restoration, of this rewilding program. And they become to be part of our park wardens. And of course, they are members of the local community and they become in some way ambassadors of what we were doing. At the beginning, of course, super not well understood, but over time were little by little were better understood. Of course, these gauchos, these cowboy guys, they had a number of abilities to be in the field. They know the area and they know the wildlife, and they start to be crucial elements for the monitoring of the wildlife in the field. So they become our first park wardens in our wildlife programs. And Huemul, the South Andean deer, a species that has less than 1,500 individuals left in the wild, was one of our iconic and flagship species and keystone for this area, with, of course, the guanaco that I already mentioned. So these gauchos, they become to be part of the monitoring through radio telemetry, census, and of course, we start a number of local activities related to reduce the threats over Huemul. One of the most important are related with disease from livestock, and the other are the pressure and the attack that domestic dogs represent to deer. In Chile, we have a severe issue with dogs that affect wildlife, not just Huemul, but wildlife in general. The other controversial species were, of course, predators and puma in particular, because the area was recognized as a reservoir of pumas. So we start monitoring programs. The family again was involved in this. Sometimes we invite the kids that were living in the headquarters of the ranch to have the chance to interact with the species that we're monitoring. So with pumas, we start to generate data about their diet, their movement, their mortality, and we share that data with the decision makers, with the wildlife authority, in some way to put information over the table to reduce the controversy, because there were pressure about compensation programs and that kind of discussions. So the primary prey of puma is guanaco in this area. This was the result of the monitoring that we developed. And the carcass that pumas provide with guanaco predation are a source of food for many scavengers like Andean condors, Austral caracara, and many other species. Over 15 and 20 species are benefit with the carrion that pumas provide. But of course, we have pumas, they are outside the park. In this case, we are in Argentina, and we arrived there because there were one of the collars that give a signal in a ranch in Argentina. So that was the ranch, many puma skins in the barn, culpeo fox, and that is today a common practice and is even a legal practice in Argentina. So it faced challenge in terms of coexistence. Today, that this is a kind of a spoiler, the park is already created, but we face today a new challenge, that is how to manage the interaction of tourists and visitors with pumas. So here we have pumas walking over the campgrounds, or a puma seat just in front of the visitor center in the park. So in parallel with the Puma program, we ran a livestock guardian program. As we were reducing gradually our sheep in the land, we start this program to show our neighbors, to show politicians and authorities that there are ways on how to coexist with predators without killing them. We know that there are a number of biological facts that don't support the retaliation, let's say the general retaliation of predators. So this program was super successful, well accepted by the local community. Even our shepherds, they were reluctant at the beginning, but later on they become the first ambassadors, saying the benefits that this kind of practice represent for coexistence. And at the end of the process, with the last sheep, we were able to increase our numbers. We sell finally all the sheep out just before the park was created, but was a great example on how to promote coexistence tools with local communities. So just producing data on puma was, of course, not sufficient to deal with the challenge of the controversy with predators. But the fact to provide real tools as livestock guardian dogs was super well accepted and even adopted by the local authorities and the Ministry of Agriculture, which start to copy this kind of programs for the local community. The other species that were involved was the Darwin's rhea. Here we face a local extinction risk, and we start a breeding program with this species. So little by little, when we start this, we were never talking about rewilding. We have in mind, let's create a park, let's recover those species that lost space, that they were in low numbers, let's recover the relationship of these species. And the Darwin's rhea is another example. So we produce manuals about the management of these species, artificial incubation, natural incubation, management of animals in captivity, and release of birds into the wild. So right now, over 10 years, we have been recovering the species and producing data. Rheas are now coexisting with guanacos and with many other species, like pampas cat is another super unknown species, and they little by little they are recovering in numbers. Of course, they were species that they were killed in the past, and now little by little we are amazed because they are recovering and appearing in new sites inside the national park. Andean condors, I already mentioned, they were not in bad numbers or in low numbers, but here we took advantage of a partnership with the Chilean Ornithologists Union, who receive on a yearly basis individuals that are rescued, and we use those individuals, those who are in good conditions, to be released into the wild, and we produce data on how condors use not just the park areas, but the areas outside the park. And of course, these are public events, and people is a super powerful event when people is connected with a huge condor of 3 meters of wingspan, and is that kind of experience that nobody forgot on their life. So we feel that is powerful. This is a picture of 2018 when the park were officially designated. We are celebrating. Chris Tompkins is in the middle. At the right of Chris is Michelle Bachelet, the former Chilean president. And of course, these are processes as all these require long-term commitment, persistence, and of course, it's a process. When we start this, nobody believed on what we were trying to accomplish. Of course, we are not just trying to conserve species. We are also thinking on how this could benefit the community or the region in terms of development. it's important to say that the ranch was sold because they were not doing well in terms of numbers, of economics. So the recovery of relationship of species represent for us a new model in terms of economics for Patagonia. We have this brand, this marketing that we developed with the Chilean government that we named the Root of Parks of Chile. That is a model that put in the center the national parks, involve over 17 national parks and millions of hectares. And basically, we are promoting the tourist nature and the good relationship of the local communities with this area. So here we are achieving the persistence of full ecosystems. We are working with local communities, and the tourism is I would say the main driver of this new model. Of course, that just the tourism or just national parks are not solving economic issues, but they are doing a major contribution in terms that the former activity, the sheep ranching, were not really contributing for the local community. So right now, now that we are 21 years later, the local communities are part of those benefits that this park and others represent for them. So, yeah, thank you very much for your attention. I don't know how I'm in time, but I try to condense as much as I could.
Thank you, Christian. That was really great. And I don't know how you managed to condense all of it and give us so much information at the same time, but it was really, really interesting. And I love how much kilometers of fences you've managed to take out. And yeah, it's been really, really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to invite all of our speakers on the screen virtually. And so that we can open up to the Q&A. We have around 15 minutes for this, I believe. So there are a few questions in the chat, and we can kind of delve into that and see how much time we go through. It's a little challenge every time for speakers to keep their answers brief, but we'll see. We'll see how we go. I'm going to start with actually a personal question, as I'm here. And this has been listening to each presentation is kind of a question that also pops up every time. And this is, I wanted to know what surprised you the most in your rewilding journey. And this can be in the species that sprung up or the relationships with people, organizations, and or what the landscape kind of what you discovered through the landscape as well. I will start with Christian on this one so that we can just go back that way. What has surprised most?
I will try to address briefly. I think that for me, and this is super personal, I would say, is I arrived to this particular project thinking on how we can move as fast as we can to recover the ecosystem, but without really thinking on people at that time. So over time, I realized, and being in the field, sharing with the community, with the gauchos, to be really imbued with what is going on the area, you start to understand the other perspectives. And I'm a veterinary doctor, but so was really new for me, let's say the social or the human dimension. That was the primary learning for me. How important is that dimension in terms or on how to uh, address your objectives and how to combine your, let's say, super scientific or wildlife or rewilding objectives with how to integrate that. So that for me was the main learning.
That's a really good point. The merging the science and the social, and we have that with many alliance partners who say that they sometimes it's not just scientists that they like field, it's also social sciences, so that you can be able to speak to people and be able to listen, as Tim you mentioned as well. Thank you for that. On to you, Stefan. How would you answer that question?
Yeah, what surprised me most is probably the rapid recovery of Saiga, which we didn't expect as it happened. There was always kind of the goal to restore the populations of Saiga and get them back into the landscape, but the speed of this recovery really is a big surprise, which is due to their biology and shows that if you get the conditions right, so if you control threats through through poaching or infrastructure or disease, then Saiga is a very nice species to work with because they do the rest and can reproduce quickly and recover from also catastrophes. So just 11 years back, there was a mass die-off in one of the populations, and now there are far more than 1 million animals. So that's a big surprise, but also, as I mentioned during my talk, a challenge because we have to adapt to this very new situation.
Yeah, of course. I might actually delve a bit deeper on that one because we had two questions come up around the natural predators of the Saiga, and so maybe you can answer this one in that context as well. So both Laura and Paula, in different ways, have just wondered what the natural predators are for the Saiga, and if they're naturally coming back, or if there's a contributing factor in that aspect as well.
There are not many natural predators for Saiga. The main one is the wolf in Kazakhstan. Other predators are usually too small to prey on Saiga, except for the calves, the juveniles in summer. And even wolves can only get animals which are sick, old, or too young, and under certain weather conditions, which give advantages for the wolf. So the wolf population in Kazakhstan was very small. It was not even a hunting species. It was a species which you, as a pest species, should basically hunt whenever you can, and you would even get a reward for this. So not even a license was necessary, and people used this opportunity quite intensely. And we managed to change this, to lobby for changes in the legislation in Kazakhstan, so that the wolf is now a hunted species, a usual hunted species with a quota. And this allowed the species in the regions, especially where the Saigas are, to recover slowly, but it's a slower process. They're not as fast as Saiga. And but still, if the wolf population would be larger than now, I think the impact on the Saiga population would be rather small still, considering the size of the Saiga population. So the wolves are needed and should be there also to control disease. So that's why we lobby for them to recover and to play their role in the ecosystem. But the Saiga has a history of dramatic population crashes and then quick recoveries afterwards. And this is due to other reasons, not predators.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. And on to you, Tim, about the more surprising aspect of your journey.
Yeah, I was thinking actually about a pleasant surprise. When you work in a sector that is trying to do difficult things, you're reversing declines, you're trying to sort of put the world to right. It's not easy. And there are reasons behind those problems in the first place, and so you're constantly thinking about those barriers and how they can be addressed. And there's something about the story of the scimitar horned oryx that I guess to my pleasant surprise, everybody seemed to get behind. So even going back to the early days of bringing stakeholders together internationally, and we're going back to about 2008, I think. There was very quick agreement on the vision, and that soon translated to quick agreement on the big principles and the vision with Chad and people locally there as well. So and why that is, I don't know. Maybe the significance, the cultural significance of the species. Maybe there are not many species, frankly, that have gone extinct in the wild And I can only think of six large mammals that have gone extinct in the world and been put back entirely from captive bred stock. I guess that resonated with a lot of people, but it certainly helped to open a lot of doors and bring a lot of goodwill to the process that we're very thankful for.
Thank you. Do you think that this is something, it was also a question from Ethan, but do you think that there is a potential to connect to large habitats in Niger as well? So connecting between countries, because maybe you're seeing that sort of commitment and welcoming of these species back.
That's certainly something. If you're asking me about looking into the future, I mean, as it is, as I think, as I said at one point in my presentation, going in one sense, going from zero to having several hundred oryx, for example, is quite a big step. On the other hand, that's very, very few animals in a very, very big place, because you're talking about areas that are, the size of small countries. The fact that we've seen ADACs move from Wadi Rim, Wadi Ashim to Enedi within Chad shows that potential for re-establishing that connectivity of wildlife. Transboundary is obviously a slightly different matter, and there are certain aspects of that in some cases national boundaries are more porous than you might think, and wildlife can get through. But on the other hand, sometimes these border areas are, somewhat insecure and can be difficult. But as you may have seen on the map that I showed earlier, collectively there's something like 230,000 kilometers squared of established reserves that could make a massive, massive difference. And obviously we need resources, and we need the usual sort of political and local will to make that difference. And I have to say, local agendas are really, really important, and it may have been something I should have really sort of stressed in my presentation earlier on, that internationally Sahara Conservation is responding with resources and trying to generate interest for actually things that people want to do locally. There are certainly a lot of things that may be stepwise progression on the way, but with a fair wind, to Ethan's point, maybe we could see that one day.
Yeah, it's a region that doesn't get much attention, and as you said, the desert usually gets bad rep as being very empty landscapes, but they're quite full. Thank you for that. I'm gonna head to a question more about landscapes. So there was a question here, and I'm going to merge two of our attendees into one, and this is more to do with the recovery of vegetation or landscapes. And Christian, maybe on to you on that note. What recovery have you seen in the vegetation through the reintroduction, the coming back of certain species in these landscapes?
Well, first in the case that I shared about the case of Patagonia National Park, there is a good news that was first we didn't have the extinction of species. We had species that were in low numbers by the pressure of the livestock grazing and sheep. So we had, I would say, in grasslands, of course, we had severe damage because where the carrying capacity was exceed. We had erosion, and we are in areas that they are in some way they are semi-arid conditions, so the rate of recovery is pretty slow. So the damage is huge. Even so, of course, after over 20 years now, some areas they were without livestock there. Of course, we have seen signs of recovery of grasslands, not all on homogeneous way. So that is one important thing. The second is that I mentioned that we have forested areas, for instance, that they were used with cattle grazing, and cattle grazing affect the regeneration of forests. So we have seen how forests are coming back after 20 years because from those areas, for us, they were primary areas that we decided to remove as soon as we could the livestock because those were areas inhabited by the endangered wemul deer. So this we prioritize those areas, and right now we have seen all the new generations of trees that are coming back. So we have recovery in terms of forest, we have recovery of grassland at, I would say, at a slow rate, and in general, the distribution of native herbivores like guanacos are now much more natural. They recover they probably or historical range. Again, we didn't have we there is no baseline information, so that is important. In other areas there are baseline information. In our case, there were nothing. We just had the information that there were over a century of livestock and sheep ranching in this land, and we were trying to stop that damage and give space to nature to come back, reduce threats over species that were endangered. And so with the benefits that this has for not just the species, but for the ecosystems in general.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for that answer. I guess each one of you can speak to all these different, yes, species, people, and also vegetation coming back. We always have a lot of questions around pastoralist communities, local communities, and you've each touched upon this in your different presentations. We won't have time to go around again, but there was a question that came up about kind of using this inspiring human-wildlife coexistence as a way of peace building, as a way of creating more harmony between humans, and also humans and wild animals as well. Stefan, do you feel like this can be something that can be taken inspiration from one aspect to the other? Because in the work that you're doing a lot of work on this human wildlife conflict.
Yes, I think tackling human wildlife conflicts is always about giving people a voice in wildlife management and nature conservation, so that they kind of have a share in this. And this leads to an ownership attitude in people, and so that they can care for what they see in their environment. And this helps to solve the human-wildlife conflict, but potentially also because people are satisfied with what they have and don't see any lacks of whatever they need, can also help to potentially to mitigate conflicts with other people.
Yeah.
But that's, I mean, in Kazakhstan, we don't have any big conflicts with other people, but that's at least what I can contribute to this.
Yeah, well, that's great. I mean, it's always interesting to get inspiration from different sectors, and that's what's really nice about rewilding as well, that it just touches upon so many different aspects as well. Okay, to finish off this little round, I'm going to go to a more future vision ahead, and so maybe in 30 seconds, if you could each say what you and your team are hoping for as the next element in the work that you're doing. And we can start with you, Tim.
Very interesting. So I think if we go back to the some of the species in question we're dealing with, the oryx, addax, dama gazelles, we'd obviously love to go from several hundred oryx to several thousand. We'd obviously love to go from 150-ish addax to 1,000 addax, and so on. So and with that, we want to see sort of measurable improvements in their conservation status. So seeing them come down the categories on the red list, I think is important. It would be great to see these animals one day doing what they're supposed to do, which is being really pivotal in those ecosystems and providing that ecosystem function that we No, they should have, but perhaps some of these species were not, and their interactions with the environment were not studied in the past enough to know precisely what that would be. And it would be great to have that as sort of a measured ecological outcome. The big thing will be what has this meant for people? Have people being able to continue their livelihoods in the way that they want, and bringing the kind of environmental security and stability that I think all of us, frankly, crave. This is not particular to a pastoral or any particular community. I think at the end of the day, there are very human needs around a sort of secure environment and caring for your family. And if, as a result of these initiatives, the general consensus among people in these environments is the world has got better for them, that would be a great outcome.
Great, thank you. Christian, 30 seconds.
Yeah. Well, in our case, from the lessons that we learned over these 30 years in the southern Chile, in Patagonia, we are expanding the strategy of rewilding along the continent. And we had an initiative that we named the Andean Corridor, that is basically promote collaborative work with other partners, create and identify hotspots for rewilding with keystone species along the Andes. So involving Andean condors, rheas, pumas, and so on. And of course, in all those cases, we have the three fundamentals: the community, the restoration, the ecologic restoration, and the creation of protected areas. So that is the core of our work.
Great, thank you. And Stefan, close us off.
Yeah, I think we will definitely continue, as I explained in my presentation, to work with people, to give more emphasis on involving people in our work, but also to give them a voice in the management of Saiga antelope. And at the same time, keep up Saiga conservation measures and mitigate existing threats like expanding infrastructure, linear infrastructure in Kazakhstan, fragmenting Saiga habitat, so to make the Saiga conservation success sustainable in various ways. But at the same time, also reintroducing other species, at least at one site, complementing Saiga as a grazing species, wild equids like Przewalski's horse and wild ass. That's very exciting and would be great thing to see all the three ungulates again in the steppe.
Yeah, what an exciting thing to look forward to. Thank you so much to each of you. It's been really interesting and inspiring to listen to all of your presentations. We've recently had a really interesting conversation sparked up by people who have different views when it comes to rewilding, and it's been quite an insightful conversation. So what I want to leave you all with today is, this understanding that kept coming up, that rewilding is context dependent, and that these contexts include people, domestic animals, wild animals, ecological processes that are quite specific to each landscape. So basically the whole complexity, as we've seen again through these presentations. And because of that complexity, there are different pathways towards maintaining or restoring landscapes and ecological functions. There is no one size fits all, as Carl mentioned, and even more so in the global context today. And this is something you touched upon, Tim. We have to be willing to have conversations with each other, even the uncomfortable ones. Be okay that we sometimes get it wrong and that also other people get it wrong. And just work together to get it a bit more right. And so a little note on appraising the work as well that we're all have done and are all doing. I think that this is where the strength of our movement lies. So as we've seen here and all around the world, we keep hearing examples of how nature and people surprise us as we embark on a rewilding journey. There is an abundance of creativity and success stories, and at the Global Rewilding Alliance, we get to hear about all of these stories, success stories, and share them with you all. So please follow us on our social media, get in touch so you can hear more, but you can also share your insights and thoughts and the other questions as well that we didn't manage to answer. We hopefully reach out to us so we can answer those for you. There'll be a follow-up to this webinar with a recording and also contact information of our speakers if that's what you are needing. And you can also delve into more information about the Wild Foundation or Naturnahe Weidelandschaften as well. Until then, thank you again to our speakers. Thank you so much for sharing your stories. Thank you to those who attended, the questions asked. And I wish you all a very good day, evening, morning. Thank you so much.